What if the British throne was never built for tall people? Behind centuries of crowns, scandals, and state portraits, lurk rulers who barely cleared 5 feet. From warrior queens who vanished behind curtains to kings who ruled empires while standing shorter than their swords, this isn't the monarchy you were taught in school. These are the 17 shortest royals in British history, ranked not by power, but by inches. And the smaller they were, the stranger their stories became, because sometimes the biggest legacies come in the smallest shoes. Before we shrink ourselves into royal scandals, make sure you subscribe to the channel, especially if you love your history with a side of mystery, irony, and questionable posture. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Singapore? We want to know who's out there quietly judging British monarchs with us. 1. Queen Elizabeth II. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history, the face of a global empire, and a woman who, at her full height, stood eye to eye with your average 12-year-old. At a mere 5'3", Queen Elizabeth II was many things: powerful, polished, and unbothered. But tall was never one of them. In a world of towering foreign dignitaries and statuesque royal portraits, the Queen often appeared swallowed by her own throne. Her height was never officially confirmed, which somehow made it worse. Like a state secret cloaked in tweed. Most sources float somewhere between 5.2 and 5'4", but the most credible consensus lands at a very diplomatic 5'3". Small, not tiny. Petite, not pocket-sized, but noticeably low to the ground. She made up for it, of course, with purses wielded like scepters, hats as wide as diplomatic tensions, and a voice that could slice through any awkward silence at a Commonwealth summit. The Queen never needed height. She had something better: immovable presence. Still, you couldn't help but notice how often she vanished into group photos, towered over by generals, eclipsed by prime ministers, sometimes barely visible behind floral arrangements. In footage from state dinners, she appears like a polite British comma between paragraphs of history. Quiet, curved, always in the middle of things, but never quite looming over them. And maybe that was the point. Elizabeth reigned not from a pedestal, but from the ground floor of her people's routines. Morning dogs, afternoon tea, eternal handbags. But if you thought she was small, wait until you meet her great-great-aunt with a chip on her shoulder, a pyre in her past, and a height that barely grazed the history books. 2. Queen Mary, I, Tudor. They called her Bloody Mary, but never because of her stature, though maybe they should have. Because at 5'3", Mary Tudor was the kind of monarch who had to tilt her chin just to glare at her enemies properly. Born into the Tudor dynasty, Mary inherited not just a volatile kingdom, but a delicate build, narrow shoulders, a small frame, and a height that would today place her comfortably between a Starbucks barista and a medium-sized corgi. Still, she made up for it with sheer force of will and executions. Contemporary descriptions of Mary harp on 2 things: her intensity and her size. Chroniclers of the time repeatedly noted her slightness and frailty, though it's hard to say how much of that was honest observation and how much was Catholic girl propaganda. What's clear is that Mary was short enough to disappear into the heavy velvet of her coronation robes, short enough that even her enemies sometimes described her with an almost patronizing sympathy, until she lit the match. Her medical records suggest she may have suffered from scoliosis and possibly congenital issues that affected her height and health. But none of it dampened her fire. She ruled with a rigid spine and a terrifying glare, proving that size matters a lot less when you're willing to burn people alive over your theological preferences. Ironically, her towering legacy doesn't come from anything she built, but rather from what she tried to destroy, namely Protestantism, stability, and anyone who dared interrupt her divine vision. Still, even Mary might have been forced to look up, literally, to the woman she would one day rival most in death, drama, and questionable judgment. A cousin, a Catholic, and a queen with just as much blood and even less height. By the way, if you've made it this far into royal shortness, you're our kind of people. So go ahead and subscribe for more strangely specific deep dives just like this. And let us know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it over there? Are you in a castle-sized bed at 3 a.m. or judging Tudor heights over lunch? We're listening. 3. Mary. Queen of Scots history remembers Mary Stuart as tall, tragic, and terminally misunderstood. But at around 5'3", the only thing tall about her was the pile of myths stacked posthumously on her legacy. You've seen the movies, glamorous gowns, sweeping shots of the Highlands, and Saoirse Ronan walking like she's got runway clearance. But the historical Mary was surprisingly small. The illusion of height came from her proportions. Long limbs, narrow waist, a face made for oil painting. People assumed she was tall because she looked like she should be. But by most wardrobe records and the eye-level gossip of her court, Mary stood roughly the same height as her ladies-in-waiting, who were, by design, hired not to tower. She may have been delicate in frame, but her story was anything but. Mary's height didn't stop her from commanding courts, escaping imprisonment, or marrying men with the emotional intelligence of damp wood. In fact, being slightly smaller may have helped her. She could vanish into a disguise, fit in a trunk, or be hoisted onto a galloping horse mid-betrayal. Her cousin Elizabeth I certainly wasn't looking up to her, in any sense. The two were eerily well-matched. Powerful, under 5'5", and increasingly bitter pen pals with access to armies. When Mary was eventually imprisoned and executed, it wasn't her height that doomed her. It was her existence, small, symbolic, and perpetually inconvenient. Even in death, Mary didn't grow. But her legend did, ballooned into martyrdom, Catholic sainthood fantasies, and endless cinematic reinventions. And just when you thought the tragic queens couldn't get any shorter, here comes one whose body collapsed under its own crown, and whose health was so poor she ruled from a bed and barely reached the table. 4. Queen Anne. To rule a country while barely reaching the height of a kitchen counter takes a certain kind of endurance. Queen Anne, the final Stuart monarch, stood somewhere between 5'2" and 5'3", though by the time she was done reigning, the only thing standing tall was her throne, and it probably creaked. History often remembers Anne as a background monarch. Shy, awkward, tragically overfed. But this was a woman who, despite being nearly always ill, swollen with gout, and reportedly so stiff she had to be hoisted onto her horse, still outlived nearly everyone who doubted her, including her taller, flashier relatives. Anne's short stature was always overshadowed by her other physical struggles. Contemporary portraits stretch her visually, puffing out sleeves and tucking in chins, trying desperately to grant her a dignity that her body refused to cooperate with. But underneath all that brocade was a monarch whose natural height was quite literally small, and getting smaller as her spine compressed under the weight of years and untreated disease. Still, she ruled, quietly, stubbornly, and with a core of steel that could only be seen in the worst moments. She presided over the Act of Union. She navigated a minefield of party politics. She wrote heartbreakingly vulnerable letters to her best friend, Sarah Churchill, who would later betray her, vertically and emotionally. Anne's life was defined by discomfort. 17 pregnancies, none surviving to adulthood. Chronic illness, public ridicule. And yet her height remained curiously absent from the list of her supposed weaknesses. Maybe because no one dared bend down that far to insult her. But the monarch who came after her didn't just embrace being short. She practically built an empire around it. Because next comes a woman who measured barely 5 feet, but left behind a legacy taller than most kings. 5. Queen Victoria. If you were building a queen from the ground up, Queen Victoria wouldn't be your blueprint. At just over 5 feet tall, The woman who gave her name to an entire age was so small that foreign dignitaries reportedly did double takes when she walked into the room. She was short, not slight. Victoria's presence filled palaces. Her moods filled diaries. Her grief filled entire decades. But physically? The Queen was compact, built for tight hallways and moral absolutism. Clothing measurements confirm her height hovered between 5'0" and 5'1", with some sources insisting she barely hit the 5-foot mark in her later years. She married a man significantly taller, which didn't help the optics. Prince Albert would loom in portraits, while Victoria often looked like the royal family's emotionally intense mascot. But she leaned into it, turning her stature into an aesthetic. Small, proper, unshakable. The ideal silhouette for a nation obsessed with order. There's an irony in how Victoria ruled a vast, chaotic empire while personally occupying so little space. Her size became symbolic, the tiny woman stamping her authority across continents. Colonies bowed to a monarch who could have used a stepladder to reach her own crown. But domestically, her smallness came with intimacy. She was the queen of tiny rooms, handwritten notes, and furious private opinions. Her children called her the Little Mother, and her ministers never quite knew whether to fear her or help her into a carriage. Still, for all her power, she wasn't the shortest in her family. Not even close. Because while Victoria may have defined an era, her daughter, Princess Alice, was quietly slipping through history with even less height, even more tragedy, and even fewer inches to spare. 6. Elizabeth I. If confidence could be measured in inches, Elizabeth I would have stood 10 feet tall. In reality, she was around 5'1", just tall enough to command a room, but short enough to make those towering wigs do a lot of heavy lifting. The Virgin Queen knew the value of illusion. She painted her face white, wore towering ruffs, and stacked her presence like scaffolding. Every portrait was a lie. Every outfit was theater. And every inch she lacked in physical height, she replaced with spine and spite. Clothing records and surviving garments from her reign suggest that Elizabeth was a little over 5 feet tall. This was not uncommon for the time. People were generally shorter. But even by Tudor standards, she was on the lower end. Her wardrobe was designed to counteract this. Platforms, padding, drama. She didn't just enter rooms, she constructed her own dimensions inside them. Still, it's worth noting, Elizabeth didn't need height. She weaponized intellect, cultivated menace, and turned singleness into strategy. Her small frame often misled foreign emissaries into underestimating her. It was a mistake they didn't make twice. And yet, for all her calculated grandeur, Elizabeth had one consistent rival in both power and height. Mary, Queen of Scots. The two queens were nearly identical in stature, around 5'3" or less, but couldn't have been more different in strategy. Mary leaned into emotional grandeur. Elizabeth leaned into control. One lost her head, the other kept the crown. But if you're hoping this is as short as monarchs get, think again. Because the next royal? She wasn't just short. She was described, repeatedly and with very little pity, as awkward, strange, and noticeably small. And she wasn't a queen who ruled. She was a queen who stumbled. 7. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Queen Caroline of Brunswick was short in height, short on patience, short on friends, and spectacularly short on luck. Standing at approximately 5'1", she arrived in England with royal credentials and continental confusion, only to become one of the most ridiculed, legally entangled women to ever technically become Queen of the United Kingdom. Married to George IV in what can only be described as a high-stakes arranged disaster, Caroline was mocked not just for her personality, but for her stature. Contemporary sources are brutal in their honesty. They called her short, awkward, and coarse. And in the cutthroat world of Georgian court gossip, that was the diplomatic version. Her height might not have been a political problem, if not for the fact that George was looking for someone taller, thinner, quieter, and less prone to dramatic gestures during parliamentary inquiries. Instead, he got Caroline, tiny, unfiltered, and entirely unbothered by decorum. She moved through her scandal-stuffed life like a one-woman tragicomedy, arriving late to her own trial, walking out of her own coronation, and carrying the aura of someone who always seemed to be in the wrong room, but loudly. And despite the tabloid chaos, she never grew in the public imagination, literally or figuratively. Her height, though a footnote compared to her scandals, became a metaphor for how little space she was allowed to occupy in the royal narrative. She was always seen as small, too small to be taken seriously, too odd to be loved, and too stubborn to be erased. But the next royal didn't just inherit a similar stature. He inherited everything from his mother, including her height, her fragility, and her tendency to live a very short life in more ways than one. 8. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. Prince Leopold was the son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, but he didn't inherit much of their presence. He was slight, delicate, and just over 5 feet tall, around 5'1", if we're being generous. He walked like someone trying not to be noticed by the floorboards. He spoke with the gravity of someone who'd read too many books and survived too many illnesses. And while he was technically a prince, he moved through life like an understudy for a part no one wanted. Leopold wasn't just short in stature, he was considered medically fragile. Chronic conditions followed him like a shadow, and his height was often lumped in with his other ailments. He looked young even when he was not, and when people spoke of him, they often lowered their voices, as if he might break from sound alone. His height, like most royals on this list, was not officially recorded in modern terms, but enough wardrobe data and contemporary observations exist to suggest he measured around 5'1", not alarmingly small, just easily overlooked. And for a man born into a family obsessed with ceremonial visibility, that was its own kind of tragedy. Yet Leopold was sharp. He wrote letters laced with sarcasm. He advocated for art, culture, and education. He was a miniature intellectual in a family mostly designed for reproduction and ribbon cutting. But his short stature, along with his chronic health issues, rendered him a ghost prince. Never quite expected to rule. Always expected to fail. And though he defied expectations by marrying and fathering children, his life remained a compact narrative. Short body, short life, long shadow. Still, if you thought a prince at 5'1" was small, wait until the next king, who wore the crown, rode the waves of madness, and stood almost as low as the monarchy once sank. 9. King George III. He was the monarch who lost America, who conversed with shadows, who became the poster child for royal instability. But one thing rarely mentioned about King George III, he was very, very short, standing somewhere between 5'9" and 5'1", depending on the day, the coat, or the source. Most remember him as the Mad King, a convenient label for centuries of imperial embarrassment. But before the war, before the breakdowns, before Lin-Manuel Miranda made him sing about being dumped, George was already an anomaly in royal measurements. His coronation robes were small. His trousers were famously narrow. Surviving garments suggest that he barely cleared 5 feet. And while the average height in the 18th century wasn't particularly towering, George still came in under the wire. Despite his physical size, George had an outsized obsession with control. He micromanaged parliamentary affairs, agricultural reforms, and even his children's marriages with a grip that belied his own fragility. His voice was described as high and nasal, his frame as compact, and his demeanor as intense. A small man trying to contain a very large empire. But what makes his height all the more poignant is how it reflects the shrinking nature of British authority during his reign. His stature wasn't just a measurement, it became a metaphor. The king got smaller, the empire started slipping, and soon the colonies were taller than the crown. Still, for all his shortcomings, literal and otherwise, George left a legacy of complexity. a monarch both mocked and mourned, a tiny king standing at the edge of a crumbling map. And he wasn't even the smallest, because up next is a boy king, fragile, sickly, unnervingly short, whose reign lasted barely long enough for his shoes to wear out. 10. King Edward VI. King Edward VI was barely old enough to rule, barely healthy enough to walk unassisted, and barely 5 feet tall, if that. The son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, he inherited the throne at 9 years old and died before he turned 16. His physical size, much like his reign, never quite got the chance to grow into something formidable. Accounts of Edward's health often eclipsed discussions of his stature, but when his skeletal remains were studied, a clearer picture emerged. He was very small, even for his age. Chronic illness had stunted his development. Historians estimate his height at around 5 nero, 152 centimeters at death, a measurement that might have seemed unremarkable for a sickly teenager in Tudor England, but which, combined with his fragile condition, made him appear more like a porcelain heir than a sovereign monarch. Still, Edward had the brain of a full-grown king. His letters and diaries reveal a sharp mind, deeply entrenched in Protestant reform and theological obsession. He may have been physically slight, but he ruled, on paper at least, with confidence and surprising severity. He issued proclamations, planned successions, and read scripture like it was his birthright. But Edward's smallness wasn't just physical, it was political. His reign was dominated by protectors, regents, and schemers who saw his tiny figure as a convenient puppet. He had the title of king, but never the shadow to match. He reigned, but only as long as the wind didn't change direction. And it did. Edward died young, and his body, tiny, pale, and light enough to carry without ceremony, was quietly buried with more theological weight than royal fanfare. Yet even Edward, the small king with a short reign, wasn't the shortest royal of his bloody, brilliant family. That title might belong to a woman whose legend is 10 times her size, and who wielded power with nothing more than a glance and a sharp pair of eyes. 11. Anne Boleyn. She stood just around 5 feet tall, but Anne Boleyn walked into English history like she owned the staircase. And for a while, she did. Second wife of Henry VIII, mother of Elizabeth I, and possibly the shortest person in every room where she changed the course of history. Contemporary accounts fixate on her wit, her charisma, her dark allure. But modern historians, armed with measurements of her preserved wardrobe and the occasional physical descriptor, suggest she was about 5 nero, 152 centimeters. Small by any standard, especially for someone who dared to dethrone a queen, change the religion of a country, and flirt with a king like it was a sport. Her size, ironically, may have been part of her mystique. Anne was described as having a presence that far exceeded her frame. She didn't need height. She had nerve. She didn't ask for power. She dared people to deny it to her. Her charm was calculated, razor-sharp, and entirely disarming. In a world where royal women were supposed to be ornamental, Anne used her smallness like a blade. Disarming, then decisive. But power, as always, has a price. When things went south, Anne's petite stature became part of the case against her. Easy to diminish, easier to dismiss. The same woman who once captivated a monarch became politically inconvenient and physically forgettable. Yet her legacy endured. Her daughter would go on to be one of England's greatest rulers. Her enemies outlived her, but never shook her shadow. Anne Boleyn didn't just change the monarchy. She redefined how power could look, even if it came in small packages. Still, Anne wasn't the smallest royal at court. The next queen was famously tiny. So small that even the courtiers made jokes, and somehow she still outlived her own scandal-ridden husband. 12. Queen Catherine of Braganza. At around 5 no, 152 centimeters, Queen Catherine of Braganza arrived in England and was immediately declared too short to be queen, by a public who had apparently expected someone at least taller than a wine cask. But Catherine didn't come to impress with height. She brought a dowry, a taste for tea, and a quiet strength that outlasted both wars and ridicule. Born a Portuguese princess and married off to Charles II, Catherine walked into a hostile court that resented her Catholicism, her accent, and, yes, her size. The Restoration Court was a loud, lusty, and chaotic place. Catherine was none of those things. She was small, reserved, and tightly wound, like a porcelain doll left in a room full of drunks. Court satire was brutal. She was mocked for being short, dark, and foreign. Her failure to produce an heir only intensified the whisper campaign, with every miscarriage treated like a personal insult against the English throne. And yet, she endured, quietly, dignified, impossibly small, and endlessly underestimated. She introduced tea to the English court, an act that would reshape British culture. She kept her faith when others advised conversion. She survived being sidelined by mistresses, ignored by diplomats, and targeted by anti-Catholic hysteria. Her stature never changed, but her presence? Unshakable. Over time, Catherine became a symbol of dignified resistance, not the kind that writes speeches, but the kind that just keeps showing up, every day, 5 feet tall and absolutely unbothered. Still, her height was only impressive until you meet her daughter-in-law's daughter, another royal born of Queen Victoria's famously low gene pool, who came in under 5 feet and was known in court circles as the little one with the iron will. 13. Princess Beatrice, youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. She was Queen Victoria's favorite child, and one of her smallest. Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter of Britain's most famously diminutive monarch, stood somewhere between 4'11" and 5'0". The Victorian court, never known for subtlety, routinely described her as diminutive, delicate, and, when they were being uncharitable, too tiny to take seriously. But Beatrice wasn't fragile. She was forged in the iron will of her mother's shadow. Being the baby of the family didn't mean indulgence, it meant service. Victoria effectively assigned her daughter the role of lifelong companion, and Beatrice accepted it with a quiet obedience that made her seem almost spectral in the royal lineup. She hovered around the queen like a footnote, always present, rarely centered. Her height became part of her invisibility. She was literally overlooked by taller siblings, louder politicians, and a mother who made every royal moment about herself. But Beatrice found other ways to leave a mark. After Queen Victoria's death, she took on the mammoth task of editing and redacting her mother's journals, wielding her pen with more control than anyone had ever given her in life. That tiny figure in Black Widow's weeds? That was Beatrice, trimming the edges of royal history to fit the portrait she preferred. For someone so small, she managed to control the legacy of an empire. She was also a wife and mother, eventually marrying Prince Henry of Battenberg and raising 4 children. But always, she remained physically petite and emotionally tethered to the throne she was born under. Her story was quiet, but not forgettable. Her size didn't make her powerful, but it made her dangerous to underestimate. Still, if Beatrice was the smallest daughter of Victoria, the next royal makes even her look statuesque. A sister, a mirror, a woman who measured barely 4'11", and whose life unraveled faster than the empire she was born into. 14. Princess Alice, daughter of Queen Victoria. Princess Alice, the third child of Queen Victoria, was often described as the most sensitive and the least visible. Standing at just around 4'11", or 150 centimeters, she inherited her mother's short stature and perhaps a bit too much of her emotional gravity. While others in the royal family postured, Alice observed. While others posed, she wrote letters filled with philosophical introspection and understated despair. She was, in every way, the small one, not just in height, but in how little space she took up in the royal imagination. Her mother doted on Beatrice. Her father died when she was barely 10. and by the time Alice entered adulthood, she was married off to Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and promptly packed off to a minor German principality with more horses than history. In court portraits, Alice seems to vanish between larger figures, her slight frame almost lost in the fabric. Her dresses were narrow, her voice described as soft, and her presence consistently overlooked by observers who had come to expect queens, not thinkers. But Alice left behind more than just a fading silhouette. She raised a generation of royals who would marry into almost every European throne, including the ill-fated Alexandra, Tsarina of Russia. And while her own life was cut short, her influence reached far beyond her size. In a world of imperial pomp, Alice was a quiet rebel, advocating for better medical care, personally nursing the sick, and corresponding with theologians on questions too heavy for most monarchs. Her small stature belied her complexity. But still, she was never tall, and she certainly wasn't the shortest. Because next comes a queen so refined, so elegant, and so fashionably petite that almost no one noticed she was under 5 feet tall, until they stood next to her. 15. Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII. Queen Alexandra had a gift, the kind of delicate beauty that made people forget how small she really was. At just around 4'11", 150 centimeters, the Danish princess-turned-British queen consort stood shorter than most of her ladies-in-waiting, shorter than the average Victorian lamppost, and definitely shorter than the enormous public image she projected. She wasn't just petite, she was sculpted, regal without being grand. A walking contradiction, slim and graceful, yet so physically unassuming that newcomers at court sometimes missed her entirely until she spoke. And once she did, you listened. Alexandra's presence wasn't loud, it was glacial. She moved like royalty had always moved, elegantly, distantly, and just a little bit detached. Her height, rather than detracting from her image, actually intensified it. She didn't need to command a room, the room rearranged itself around her, but she wasn't without substance. Behind the delicate features and fragile frame was a woman of steel. She endured her husband's serial infidelities with public grace and private frost. She adapted to a foreign country, reshaped the image of the royal consort, and turned her modest frame into a fashion icon silhouette. Entire generations of women copied her walk, her choker necklaces, which she wore to cover a scar, and her impossibly dainty style. Her height was rarely mentioned in official records, perhaps out of discretion, perhaps because no one dared notice. But it was there, quiet, consistent, almost poetic. She stood just under 5 feet tall, and yet her presence towered over a court full of schemers, statesmen, and scandal-hardened royals. Still, even Alexandra, beautiful, poised, and perfectly engineered for portraiture, wasn't the smallest. Because next we meet a prince, a boy who never became a man, a royal who never quite reached the height, or the life, expected of him. 16. Prince John, youngest son of George V. Prince John was the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, and one of the most mysterious royals in 20th century British history. His physical height? Somewhere between 4'10" and 4'11", 147, 150 centimeters. His public footprint? Practically non-existent. For most of his short life, Prince John lived on the margins, small in stature, hidden from view, and carefully edited out of the family's grand imperial image. Born in 1905, John was a cheerful, affectionate child, but his development soon diverged from royal expectations. By the time he was 6, it was evident he wouldn't grow like his siblings, physically or socially. His small size became one of many factors that set him apart. Court records describe him as unusually short for his age, and photos show a boy consistently smaller than his royal brothers, even those younger than him. But it wasn't just about inches. It was about visibility, or rather, the lack of it. As he grew, John was gradually removed from the spotlight. Officially, it was for his health. Unofficially, it was about optics. A monarch in waiting needed to be a towering figure. John wasn't. And in a monarchy increasingly obsessed with public image, there was little room for someone who couldn't physically measure up, literally or symbolically. He lived most of his final years at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a quiet place far removed from London's grandeur. There, he was cared for with genuine affection, but also kept separate, out of sight, out of narrative. His height was rarely discussed explicitly, but it served as a metaphor for how the royal institution handled its outliers, gently, quietly, and with a profound sense of discomfort. Still, even John wasn't the shortest. Because the smallest British royal ever measured by science didn't just walk through history, he limped through it, bent under the weight of both his spine and his sins. 17. King Richard III. King Richard III is, without question, the shortest British royal ever scientifically measured. At first glance, that may sound surprising. After all, Shakespeare didn't call him short. He called him a monster, a villain, a bunch-backed toad. But when archaeologists unearthed his skeleton in a Leicester parking lot in 2012, they found something even more dramatic than Tudor propaganda. A man who stood about 5'8" if straightened, but whose severe spinal curvature made his functional height around 4'10", In other words, he never stood tall in life, not once. It reframes everything. The image of the crooked tyrant, the twisted soul, the unlovable usurper. It wasn't just literary flair, it was biography. Richard wasn't simply a short king. He was a king bent sideways, literally, a monarch whose body mirrored the political chaos of his reign. But he wasn't born monstrous. He was born royal, the 11th child of the Duke of York, raised among towering brothers and shifting alliances. His physical condition didn't prevent him from riding into battle, holding power, or wearing a crown. But it did leave him visibly different, a fact that Tudor chroniclers would later turn into metaphorical gold. His armor had to be specially fitted, his robes tailored for a curved back. His presence? Described as commanding, but never physically imposing. The real tragedy is that for centuries, Richard's actual height, and the reason behind it, was hidden beneath layers of political myth and dirt. It took 500 years and a parking permit to find the truth. At roughly 4'10" of real-world stature, Richard III remains a study in contrasts. Small in height, enormous in legacy. A ruler remembered more for how he fell than how he stood. And maybe that's the final irony. He ruled a kingdom he couldn't quite reach, and cast a shadow taller than himself.